Warsaw, 1939. The city was still waking up from a grey morning when the sky filled with the distant echo of engines. People froze, looked up, and then ran. The first bombs hit the streets like thunder from the heavens. Within hours, the Polish capital was burning. Families fled through smoke and rubble, and among them was a young nurse named Irena Sendler, clutching her medical bag as buildings collapsed around her. She had no idea then that her life was about to change the course of thousands of others. When Germany invaded Poland, the world of ordinary people collapsed. Laws changed overnight. The Jewish population, once neighbors and friends, were suddenly labeled as enemies. By 1940, the Nazis had sealed more than 400,000 Jews inside a small section of Warsaw, the infamous Warsaw Ghetto. Starvation, disease, and terror spread faster than medicine could cure. The streets were filled with silence, broken only by the cries of hungry children. Irena worked for the city's Department of Social Welfare. Her job allowed her to deliver food and medicine to the poor, a perfect cover for what she was about to do. She was a quiet woman, small in stature but unshakable in will. Her eyes saw what others tried to ignore: children dying in the streets, families separated by barbed wire, humanity fading under the boots of soldiers. One night, she told herself, if I don't act now, they will all disappear. She started small. At first, she smuggled food and medicine through hidden pockets in her coat. But as conditions worsened, she began something far more dangerous: smuggling children out of the ghetto itself. Every trip could mean death. The penalty for helping Jews was execution, not just for her but for anyone who assisted. Yet she didn't stop. Irena joined the Polish underground resistance group WWII, a secret network dedicated to saving Jewish lives. With their help, she forged documents, created false identities, and built routes of escape. But the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was convincing parents to let go of their children, often forever. Imagine the moment: a mother holding her baby close, knowing that sending the child with a stranger might be the only way to save its life. Irena would kneel beside them and whisper, "Your child will live. I promise." There was no one way out of the ghetto. Sometimes she hid babies in toolboxes or potato sacks, older children inside ambulances marked infectious. Other times, she trained dogs to bark at Nazi checkpoints, covering the cries of infants hidden beneath stretchers. She used every trick she could imagine. Each successful rescue gave her courage to try again. The Germans controlled every gate, every street, every exit. But even they couldn't stop courage wrapped in a nurse's uniform. One cold morning, she walked through the checkpoint with an unconscious child hidden in a burlap bag, claiming it was a corpse of a typhus victim. The soldiers waved her through without opening it. The corpse inside was still breathing. Irena knew that saving a child meant more than just escaping the ghetto. It meant giving them a new identity. She worked tirelessly with priests, nuns, and ordinary Polish families willing to hide them. Some children were placed in convents or orphanages, others given to Catholic families with forged baptism certificates. To the Nazis, they became invisible, swallowed by the noise of war. But Irena didn't want them to disappear forever. She carefully recorded every child's real name, the name of their new family, and where they were hidden. She wrote the information on tiny slips of paper and sealed them in glass jars, burying them beneath an apple tree in her neighbor's garden. Her dream was simple but almost impossible: that when the war ended, these children could find their parents again. The risk grew each day. Gestapo informants were everywhere, and suspicion followed her like a shadow. Once she was stopped by German soldiers at a checkpoint. They searched her bag, asked her questions, and stared into her eyes. Her pulse raced. Inside her coat, taped against her chest, was a list of real names, evidence that could condemn dozens of families to death. Somehow she smiled and said calmly, "I'm just delivering medicine for the sick." They let her go. She walked away, heart pounding, but she never showed fear. As months turned into years, Irena and her small team saved hundreds, then thousands. The streets of Warsaw changed. The ghetto shrank. The cries became whispers. By 1943, the Nazis began liquidating what remained, sending train after train to Treblinka, a death camp where no one returned. Irena worked even harder, smuggling as many children as she could before the gates closed forever. Each child she rescued felt like a small victory against an empire built on hate. But every act of courage has a cost. In October 1943, the Gestapo came for her. They knew someone was forging papers, helping Jews vanish from the ghetto. A neighbor saw men in black coats pounding on her door. Irena had seconds to react. She burned every list she had in her apartment except for one, the list buried in the jars. When the soldiers burst in, she stood still, pretending not to understand why they were there. They searched everything, tore apart her room, then dragged her into the street. Neighbors watched in silence, afraid to even whisper her name. Irena Sendler, the woman who had saved thousands, was now a prisoner of the regime she had defied for years. At the Gestapo headquarters on Sucha Avenue, she was beaten and interrogated. They demanded names, of her helpers, of the children, of the families hiding them. Each refusal brought more pain, but she said nothing. They broke her legs, her arms, and left her half dead on a cold cell floor. Still, she protected the secret that was more valuable than her life, the names in those buried jars. When news of her arrest reached the underground, Jagota acted fast. They bribed a German guard with a huge sum of money. One night, he left the prison gate open, and Irena's name appeared on a public list of executed prisoners, even though she was alive. To the Nazis, she was officially dead, but in the shadows, the woman who had outsmarted them returned to hiding. She changed her name and continued her work in silence. Her body was broken, but her spirit wasn't. Even in pain, she found ways to help those still trapped. The war dragged on, the city burned, but she never stopped believing that someday the children would come home again. When the war finally ended in 1945, the ghetto was gone. The apple tree still stood, and under its roots the glass jars waited. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Warsaw was unrecognizable. The city Irena once knew had turned into a skeleton of ruins and dust. Half the population was gone, the streets were silent, and the smell of smoke and death still hung in the air. The war had ended, but the echoes of what it destroyed would haunt generations. Irena Sendler, weak and limping from her injuries, walked carefully through what remained of her city. Every street held memories, of laughter that once filled courtyards, of children she'd smuggled through secret passages, of faces she'd never see again. Her legs ached with every step, her hands still trembled from months of torture, but her mind was set on one thing, the jars. She reached the garden where she had buried them, the apple tree that had stood like a quiet witness through all the chaos. The earth was harder now, cracked and dry, but she dug with her bare hands until her fingers bled. And then, like a miracle, the glass surfaced. Inside were the names, hundreds of tiny papers, faded but still legible. Real names, false names, addresses. The children were alive somewhere in Poland, and she was the only one who knew where. But the hope she carried quickly turned into heartbreak. Most of the parents she wanted to reunite with their children were gone, vanished into the fires of Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. Out of the thousands she tried to find, only a handful of families survived. For many children, their real identities had died with their mothers and fathers. They were now strangers to their own past. Irena faced a choice. She could reveal everything and risk the children being lost again, or protect their new lives, their new families, even if it meant burying the truth once more. She decided to go slowly, carefully tracing one name at a time. The process was painful. Imagine walking to a house with a name from a jar, knocking on a stranger's door, and seeing a child who no longer remembered their real parents, a child now speaking Polish prayers, wearing a cross, living with people who truly loved them. For some, the truth was too heavy to face. Many of those who survived the war had already lost too much. Some of the adoptive parents refused to let the children go. Others wept and begged Irena to let them stay. She never forced them. She said softly, "The war took enough. Let's not take love away too." The years after the war were cruel in another way. Poland fell under Soviet control, and heroes like Irena, who had worked with the underground, were no longer celebrated. The new communist regime distrusted anyone who had ties to the resistance. Her story was quietly erased from history. She returned to her nursing job, limping through hospital halls, treating patients who had no idea that the woman cleaning their wounds had once defied the Gestapo and saved thousands of children. But she never sought fame. To her, the real victory was that those children had lived. She kept in touch with some of them, writing small letters, exchanging quiet words of gratitude. A few would visit her years later, grown up, bringing their own children, proof that her courage had planted new generations. Still, she carried guilt. In quiet moments, she would whisper prayers for the children she couldn't save, for the mothers who handed her babies through cracks in the ghetto wall, trusting her with their last hope. Those faces never left her mind. She said once, "I still hear their cries at night. I only did what my heart told me to do." In 1965, long after the world had moved on, her name reached Israel. The Jewish organization Yad Vashem began searching for people who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. When they found Irena's story, they were astonished. The documents, the testimonies, the lists of children, everything confirmed the impossible truth. She was invited to Israel and honored as one of the righteous among the nations. But even then she stayed humble. When asked if she felt like a hero, she said, "Heroes do extraordinary things. I only did what was normal." Back in Poland, the recognition was quiet. The communist government allowed little mention of her wartime past. Her courage, her arrests, her underground work, all of it remained hidden in silence. Decades passed, and she faded into obscurity. An old woman living in a small apartment, her legs still crippled from Gestapo torture. Few people outside her small circle even knew her name. But history has a strange way of rediscovering its lost voices. In 1999, over half a century later, a group of high school students in Kansas, USA, stumbled upon her story while researching the Holocaust. They found just a few lines about her, a nurse who saved 2,500 Jewish children. Curious, they began to dig deeper, collecting fragments from archives and interviews. What they uncovered stunned them. They turned her story into a play called Life in a Jar. When the play premiered, audiences were silent, some in tears. Word spread quickly, and soon journalists and historians from around the world were asking the same question. Who was this woman, and how did we forget her? By the early 2000s, Irena Sendler was finally being recognized as the hero she'd always been. Awards poured in, interviews followed, but she always spoke softly, always bringing the conversation back to the children. "I only wish," she said in one interview, "that I could have done more." As she grew older, her body weakened, but her memory remained sharp. She could still recall the names of the children, the streets she walked, the fear that never left her. She kept a small box beside her bed, filled with letters from the grown-up children she once saved, each one a life that might not have existed without her. When asked if she ever forgave the Germans, she paused and said, "Forgiveness belongs to God. My job was only to love." The children she saved would go on to become teachers, doctors, writers, parents, the living proof of her quiet war against evil. Every one of them carried a piece of her courage. And though many never knew their real parents, they all knew the name of the woman who gave them life a second time, Irena Sendler. She died in 2008, at the age of 98, in the same city where her story began, Warsaw. The apple tree where she buried the jars no longer stands, but its memory lives on in every child she saved. The story of Irena Sendler is not about war. It is about compassion in its purest form, the power of one person to stand against the darkness and say, "Not this child, not today." The world had moved far beyond the ashes of the war, but the echo of what Irena had done was beginning to travel again, carried quietly from one voice to another. By the time she turned 90, journalists and historians were finally realizing that one of the greatest acts of heroism in the 20th century had been performed not by a soldier or general, but by a nurse with a limp. Her small apartment in Warsaw became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors from across the world came to see the woman whose hands had carried babies through sewer tunnels and narrow alleys. The doorbell would ring, and she'd shuffle slowly to the door with her cane. Sometimes a man in his 60s or 70s would stand there, trembling, and say, "You don't know me, but you saved me." She would smile, take his hands in hers, and whisper, "Oh, but I do know you. You were one of my children." They came from all over, Israel, France, America, Argentina. Many had built full lives, raised children and grandchildren of their own. Yet standing before her they felt small again, like the frightened souls she once carried out of the ghetto. Some brought photographs, family trees, stories, One woman showed her a photo of her grandchildren and said, "There are 32 of us now. Because of you." For Irena, each visit was a reminder of the promise she had kept, that no matter how dark the world became, kindness could still save it. But she also carried a sadness that never faded. For every child who lived, she remembered the ones who didn't make it out. "I wasn't a hero," she often said. "Heroes do more than I did. I only tried to help when I saw people drowning in sorrow." When the story of life in a jar spread across the world, reporters flooded her small home. Cameras rolled, flashbulbs popped, but Irena didn't like attention. Her voice was soft, her movements slow, yet every word she spoke carried the weight of a century. "I only wish," she said, "that people would remember the parents. The true heroes were the mothers and fathers who gave away their children to save them." That pain cannot be measured. In one interview, she described the moment that haunted her most. It was winter 1942. A mother pressed her baby into Irena's arms and said, "Promise me she will live." The woman refused to give her name. She kissed the baby once, whispered something in Yiddish, and stepped back through the wall. Irena never saw her again. "Sometimes," she said, "I still see her face in my dreams. I see the strength it took for her to let go." The world finally began to honor her. She received Poland's highest civilian award and later, the Order of the White Eagle. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. When she heard the news, she smiled faintly and said, "I am grateful, but I already hold my prize." It's in the laughter of the children who lived. Still, even as honors came, she never let herself forget the reality of evil. "I have seen what hatred can do," she said. "It begins small, with words, with silence, with indifference. And then suddenly it grows into something no one can control." She often warned the young people who came to visit her, the world is always one step away from losing its humanity. Guard that step. Her health began to decline after her 94th birthday. The long years of pain left her body frail, but her spirit was still sharp. Even from her bed, she kept in touch with the children she'd saved, many now old themselves. They called her their Polish mother. When asked what gave her the courage to defy the Nazis, she replied quietly, "I was raised to believe that when someone is drowning, you must jump into the water to save them, even if you don't know how to swim." Her story also reignited something in Poland. Schools began to teach about her. Memorials were built and streets named in her honor. For decades, she had been forgotten in her own country. But now her name was being spoken again, by children who had never known war, but who learned what bravery looked like from her life. In Israel, the Yad Vashem Museum created a permanent exhibit in her honor. A photograph of a young Irena in her nurse's uniform stood beside a quote she once said, "I could have done more. This regret will follow me until I die." Visitors often paused there, reading her words in silence. And yet, even as her story was celebrated, Irena remained humble. When a journalist once asked if she was proud, she shook her head and said, "Pride? No. I'm only thankful that I was not born in a time where I had to choose between being human and being safe, because in those times many chose wrong." One of her most emotional reunions came in 2005, when she met a group of 20 survivors she had saved as children. They gathered in a small Warsaw hall, lighting candles in memory of the families who had perished. One man stood up and said, "You gave us life, and now we give you our hearts." Irena wept quietly. She told them, "If I had to live my life again, I would do it the same way, even if it meant the same pain." Her legacy became more than just history. It became a lesson in moral courage. Around the world, teachers began using her story to show how one person's choices could change thousands of lives. Universities studied her as a symbol of civil resistance and human compassion. As her final years approached, she spent her days surrounded by letters, photographs, and memories. On her bedside table there was a small jar, not one of the original ones, but a new one, filled with tiny folded notes. Each note had a name written by the people she had saved. They wanted her to know they were still alive, still remembering. She would hold that jar and smile softly, whispering, "This is my garden now." In interviews, when asked what she wanted people to remember, she said, "That silence helps the oppressor, never the victim. That when we see someone suffering, we cannot look away." Her words carried the weight of everything she had lived through: war, torture, survival, and the fragile miracle of hope. By 2008, her health had worsened, and she rarely left her bed. Yet she still greeted visitors with warmth, her eyes bright, her memory sharp. She told a friend, "The world is full of evil, but also full of those who quietly fight against it. I was one of many." And she was right. For every Irena, there were others who risked everything. Priests, nurses, farmers, mothers, all invisible heroes in a time of madness. But few carried the quiet strength that she did, or the ability to save thousands without ever firing a shot. Her story was no longer just a chapter of history. It was a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a whisper in the dark saying, "I will help no matter what happens to me." The Gestapo officers stormed into the small apartment, their boots echoing against the wooden floors. Papers scattered, drawers ripped open, and yet Irena Sendler stood silent. Her eyes did not tremble, even as the German officer grabbed her arm and demanded the names of the children she had saved. She knew this day would come. For months, the underground whispered that the Germans were closing in. Now they had her. The interrogation room smelled of fear and iron. The Gestapo agent placed a thick folder on the table, a list of names, places, suspicions. They knew enough to make her execution certain. They wanted more, the names of her accomplices and the locations of the rescued children. When she refused, they broke her legs, but she did not speak. She fainted, was revived, and then beaten again. The pain was unimaginable, but Irena's will was stronger than the chains around her wrists. She had hidden the names of every child inside a glass jar, buried under an apple tree in her friend's garden. Each name represented a life, a family line, a future. No one could force her to give that up. Days later, her name appeared on a Nazi execution list. Her fate was sealed. But then something miraculous happened. Members of the underground resistance, the Ghetto, who worked secretly under German noses, bribed a German guard with a large sum of money. On the night of her scheduled execution, the guard took her out of her cell and led her into the woods. She thought she was being taken to her death. Instead, he whispered, "Run." Irena collapsed in the mud, broken and bleeding, but alive. The next morning, Nazi newspapers published her name among those executed. To the world, Irena Sendler was dead. But in the shadows of Warsaw, she continued to work under a new identity. Her spirit refused to die. With her legs still healing, she coordinated efforts from hiding, sending messages, organizing food deliveries, and ensuring the safety of the children she had once carried in sacks, toolboxes, and coffins. The Germans thought they had silenced her. They hadn't realized they had only made her a ghost that worked twice as hard. When the war finally ended in 1945, Warsaw was rubble. The city that once held millions now lay silent, burned and broken. But beneath the ash, life stirred again, because of people like her. After the liberation, Irena dug up the jars she had buried. Her hands shook as she lifted the glass from the earth, dirt and roots clinging to its sides. Inside were hundreds of small pieces of paper, fragile but intact. The names of every child she had rescued, their false identities, and their real ones. With help from the surviving members of Ghetto, she began the painful process of reuniting children with any surviving parents. For most, there were none. The parents had been sent to Treblinka or Auschwitz. Many of the children remembered nothing of their old lives. Some refused to believe they were Jewish. Others wept when they learned the truth. Still, Irena told each one of them, "Your parents loved you enough to let you go." Her work did not end there. She continued her life as a social worker, dedicating herself to helping orphans and the poor. For decades, few outside Poland even knew her name. Under communist rule, stories of Polish resistance that involved faith or Jewish rescue were often silenced. She lived quietly, carrying the memory of thousands of children, the ones who lived, and the ones who didn't. It wasn't until 1999, over 50 years later, that her story resurfaced, thanks to a group of high school students in Kansas, USA. They discovered her name while researching the Holocaust for a history project. What they uncovered shocked the world. Irena Sendler, a woman no one had heard of, had saved more Jewish children than almost anyone else in the entire war. She had faced down the SS, torture, and death, and yet she had chosen compassion over fear. In 2003, the President of Poland honored her with the Order of the White Eagle, the nation's highest award. In her old age, confined to a wheelchair, she smiled humbly and said, "I could have done more. This regret will follow me to my death." She passed away in 2008, at the age of 98, a woman who changed the fate of generations, whose courage shone in the darkest time in human history. Today, her name stands alongside Schindler, Wallenberg, and the other heroes who defied a monster. But unlike most, she was not a soldier, not a politician, not armed with guns or wealth. She was a nurse, armed only with compassion and a notebook full of names. She fought evil not with bullets, but with love. And in doing so, she proved something eternal, that even in a world consumed by hate, one person's kindness can save the future. Because of her, 2,500 children grew up, had children of their own, and passed down the story of a woman who risked everything for them. Irena Sendler never saw herself as a hero, but history remembers her as something greater, the nurse who defied the SS alone and won.